Hi there, and before we jump into this week's episode, here's a quick word from Michelle.
Building your career in the energy sector, especially as a woman, can be very challenging, even when you're good at what you do. There are politics and corporate dynamics at play which can be hard to understand. Navigating this alone can be very difficult, and if you've reached a place in your career where you'd like to take control and start shaping events instead of reacting to them, then you might just be a great fit to work with me. If this sounds like you, then you can connect with me wherever you like to hang out online, or email michelle@michellefraserconsultancy.com, and let's start our journey together. Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Charles McConnell. Charles has over 40 years experience in the energy transition. Charles, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Well, sure, Michelle. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I began my career after graduating in chemical engineering in 1977. Worked for 32 years for a company that was originally called Union Carbide Industrial Gases. It later became known as Praxair, and most recently Praxair and the Linde organization out of Germany, industrial gas company, have merged, and Praxair no longer exists, but it's a big part of what now makes up the Linde organization. I worked in that company for the better part of 32 years, running global businesses around the world, hydrogen and carbon dioxide, a big part of that portfolio, as well as a lot of the energy-related projects. I actually retired 14 years ago, but I've done a poor job of retiring, Michelle, because I went to work at the Battelle Memorial Institute following my retirement. Worked there for 3 years and ran the Midwestern Region Carbon Sequestration Partnership on behalf of the Department of Energy and the Battelle Institute. And as part of that relationship, was introduced to the Secretary of Energy. And the next thing you know, I was in Washington, D.C., serving as the Assistant Secretary of Energy, responsible for the fossil fuel portfolio. I did that for a few years, came back to Houston, was at Rice University for a period of time, and over the last 6 years have been at the University of Houston, running our Center for Carbon Management in Energy. And I'm continuing in that role, as well as do a lot of other activities in the marketplace these days.
That's quite an exciting career you've had. It's quite interesting that you said that you were retired 14 years, but you're still going strong, working away. Was that a conscious decision that you made?
Well, it's interesting, all the decisions you make and the plans that you have. I guess there's an old saying, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And so in this case, things come at you. Opportunities continue to come my way. I've been very, very blessed and fortunate. And certainly the energy transition and transformation of everything going on in the industry are probably the reason why I've stayed involved, and I find it exciting. So, at this age, if you're not getting up to do something that you really enjoy, you really ought to think about something else. And so I'm very, very blessed. And I think a lot of the relationships and people that I've had a chance to work with over the years, Michelle, continue to be a big part of my personal circle of not only professional relationship, but colleagues.
And that sounds amazing as well. So how did you get started off in the energy sector?
Well, I started out of college working as a plant engineer in an industrial gas facilities, making my way through the organization, learning from the grassroots. I spent probably 7, 8 years in the operations department, going from a plant engineer to a superintendent, I was able to actually quite fortunate to become a plant manager at age 29 of a very small facility, but one that, provided a lot of opportunities and responsibilities. And then I had one of those curveballs thrown my way to actually go into the sales department. And of course, my first reaction to becoming a salesman was not favorable. Frankly, I was kind of surprised, and yet I think the coaching and counseling and care of people that were involved in my life at that time early on saw it as an opportunity where to broaden your horizons, see things from a different perspective, et cetera. So I got into sales. That took me from the area in the Midwest that I originally started in with oxygen plants and steel mill facilities. It brought the transition to sales brought me into the petrochemicals industry and the refining industry down here in Houston. First time I had ever moved to Texas. And we were developing the hydrogen infrastructure in the early 90s, working with a lot of companies in different parts of refining, chemicals, electric power, et cetera. And I think the career opportunities in the industrial gas business provided a wonderful platform, Michelle, because I got involved with many, many companies in many different market segments, and all of them tended to be tied very closely to the energy business. And so from that, I'm very fortunate.
Yeah, sounds amazing. So, did you have any role models during your career, and why did you find them inspirational?
Oh yeah, I guess we all have role models. So I guess starting with my father, who worked 38 years in the steel mill, and being very into manufacturing in the steel industry, that sort of started my curiosity early on in my career in operations. I had several plant managers that I worked for and region managers that were instrumental in providing opportunities and moving me around, getting into sales and meeting different customers, actually. Many of these customers in different companies in market segments and technologies that I hadn't been exposed to before. So that those were opportunities to learn from. I also had early on in my sales career, I actually moved into a business role and spent a few years in a joint venture company between Praxair and Texaco. And again, that introduced me to the Texaco headquarters. I actually officed there for a couple of years in New York. Met a lot of people in the refining industry, which again, a whole new broad area. And then I think the other big thing that happened to me was then coming back to Praxair and going to Singapore and running our Asia business development activities out of Singapore at a time when the industry was, for us anyway, a very small part of our portfolio. It was all about growth and bringing people into the organization. And I worked for a gentleman who was our COO of the company, who took a special interest in moving me to Singapore, providing the opportunities for me. And even today, many of those folks that were not Praxair employees when I first met them, but became part of our organization, it really broadened my scope in terms of international activities, understanding how people in different parts of the world view things through the lenses that they lived in, and not simply a US lens. And that was incredibly important and has been even today, Michelle.
Yeah, I agree as well. So, was it a conscious decision to travel with your career?
Yeah, a conscious decision, I guess. Coming out of college at the time I did, it was always thought that, having a long career with a single company was always part of my objective, and a big part of the reason why. Obviously, in those days there was an aspiration to continue to take the next assignment and the next assignment, and very often you would do it and wouldn't even think about it. You would just move on. I think also, if you think about it, in the world that I lived in, there was always a formula for reaching retirement age and having the long-term pension plan that was part of it. And so it was always in my mind that, I wanted to achieve that threshold. And thankfully, at a time when I had actually achieved that, other opportunities came my way, and it was a chance to maybe break out and do new things in new circumstances. And that's what led me to the Battelle Memorial Institute after retiring from Praxair, going on to perform government service for several years as the assistant secretary. Never would have dreamed about it, Michelle. Never would have had a conscious thought about it. It was things that came my way. And then now, working at a university and having the diversity of exposure to not only young students, but also companies that are working on developing research and technology efforts within university confines and finding the connection points for that. All of that now makes it, again, it's different, it's more fun. But if you'd ever told me I would go back to university, I would have laughed. If you've ever told me I would have worked for the federal government, I would have been similarly amused, Michelle. So, it's all about opportunities. And I think at the end of the day, if you're doing what you enjoy and you're finding a way to contribute, there's a lot of ways to do it rather than just simply the one company or the one set of activities that you're locked into, but you're able to have a broader scope and range, and finding that you can make a contribution in many different ways in many areas.
I agree as well, because you have had such a very unique and diverse career pattern, and it's quite incredible that you still have some key major roles in the industry. So what do you enjoy most about your current roles just now?
Well, I think, first of all, as I mentioned before, the relationships and being involved with folks and companies that I've had a chance to work with, not only domestically, but internationally as well. I think the biggest driver right now is certainly everyone's challenge in the energy industry. People often talk about the energy transition. I refer to it more as a transformation. We are taking a lot of what we've learned and the legacy expectations of how we provide energy, consume energy, conserve it, develop it, and all of the aspects of that under the umbrella of what I would see as a changing landscape. And let me give you an example of that. In the early 90s, the biggest thing was really the whole concerns about power plants here in the United States, certainly, but around the world, coal-fired facilities producing a lot of emissions, sulfur, NOx, suspended particulates, things of that nature. And we had to employ and develop a whole suite of technologies to be able to address those emissions and make the world a cleaner place, make the world a place where energy could be ubiquitous in terms of meeting the demands of populations and growth industries. And so we did that in the power industry. And then later, we were challenged by taking sulfur out of the tailpipes of automobiles. And the technologies associated with that in refining and petrochemicals to produce new catalysts, to be able to produce new technologies that would be able to remove that sulfur and hit those standards. And that was really a big moment in the industrial gas industry for me to be involved with the hydrogen necessary to make all of that happen. And so we expanded our business exponentially over a 10-year period. And just to see that transformation with our customers, the marketplace, et cetera, coupled with the fact that we needed to meet those expectations and we needed to do it cost effectively and on a scale that we'd never operated before. New challenges, new opportunities. Similarly, going over to Asia and being involved with new people that had no idea of what our company was all about, and having that opportunity to work with them and bring them into that. I think all of those experiences really are very much connected to what's going on today. Everyone in industry, everyone in society, really, but certainly in industry, concerned now as we've now understood climate change, understood how carbon dioxide contributes to it. How are we going to effectively and sustainably address the growing demand for energy combined with the desire to lower emissions? And some people would call the energy transition moving away from one thing to another, and I don't see it that way. I see it as a transformation of being able to focus on the energy that we're producing and the growth that we're going to be required, and focusing on those emissions that are now critical to reduce, and deploying technology, deploying advanced business models, deploying the transformation that we're all going to have, not only as producers of energy, but in the consumption of it and the distribution of it, et cetera. So as a society, as we're going through all this change, I think what I remembered a long, long time ago, best time for change is when times are changing. And they certainly are right now. And that's what gets me up every day, because that's the excitement, that's the juice, I guess, in the industry, because it's so needed, and to find that pathway toward real sustainability, not just focusing on environmental issues or not just focusing on cost and reliability, but doing both in terms of being able to thread the needle. And staying in the middle of that conversation is what I embrace and feel very strongly about, and really trying to provide that kind of insight and being able to direct our efforts, not just at the university, but in project development across the country.
That sounds amazing. Do you think that we would be able to achieve sustainability in the energy sector?
It's going to require education, Michelle. And that's what's sorely lacking in this conversation. I believe what I have seen, and again, my time in Washington opened my eyes in a big way. Everything tends to be politicized these days. And so there's axes to be ground in just about every corner of the argument and part of the conversation. And that's what's troubling to me. But at the same time, being able to articulate, to be able to discover along with people and have them discover the realities of the energy mix. Where does the energy come from? How do you deliver it? How can it be sustainable in terms of being available and reliable to a growing population around the world, in many places in the world that don't actually have access to energy even today? And making certain that that whole focus around available energy and reliable energy is met also with cost and affordability, where people around the world can actually have that affordable power. And then at the same time, doing it with an environmental responsibility. And by the way, it's not just electricity, Michelle. I mean, less than 40% of the energy we consume as a society is electricity. The other 60+% is hydrocarbon-based activities with fuel and chemicals and building materials and all the things that make up our modern society. And so this idea that we're going to simply transition away from fossil fuels and move into this fully 100% net zero renewable world, I believe is in some ways a naive view of how we're going to make this transformation. It's not as if we're not attempting to solve the issues or solve the problems or argue them away, not by any stretch. It's the ability to create a transformative pathway to the future that allows us to maintain the standard of living at a cost we can all afford and make the impact on emissions that's so critical. And so I spend a lot of my time, Michelle, talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. A lot of my time talking about hydrogen and the hydrogen economy and how it's going to make a difference. and all of the transformational technologies where we can look at carbon dioxide again in a way we can utilize it, store it certainly in major situations, make the transformations into the energy storage space and integrate more and more renewables and all of the things that people are talking about. But it's not going to all happen by playing one note. This is a symphony, and it has to get coordinated and conducted so that the end result is harmonious and we get the kind of impact that we want as a society.
I think so too. I do think so too. I think that we'll still have to have some sort of fossil fuel for quite a while until we're working on how to become sustainable.
We're going to need fossil fuels simply because not only are we looking to produce electricity, but we have to also know that most of the carbon and the hydrogen that make up the petrochemicals that drive our world and create all of the advancements that we've had since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that's not going to go away tomorrow. You cannot make ethylene from a wind turbine. I mean, it's just that disconnection, I think, when people begin to talk about the net zero future that we're all aspiring to. I mean, I think it's great to have an aspiration to be able to eliminate all CO2 emissions. But I also think there's a reality here in terms of the world that we've developed and in terms of the expectation of society, in terms of what they are going to need for energy, expect, be willing to pay for. And as I've often said, Michelle, people don't sacrifice as a natural behavior. So what they're looking is for industry. In some ways, industry is a victim of their own success. They want magic from industry. That's what they want. They don't want to be inconvenienced. They don't want to pay a nickel more, but they certainly want the magic. And I think that's the big challenge that's out there and is going to be a big part of the world over the next 10, 20, 30 years to make this transformation occur, working with new technologies, working with new business models, working with the expectations of the future, and doing it with clear eyes. Because every solution, quote unquote, has consequences and unintended consequences. And being able to really understand that, great example of that is critical minerals becomes really, really important in terms of electrification. Things like copper and lithium and all these materials and the mining required for them to make this transformation. It's not going to happen with just simply a snap of the fingers. It's going to require an exponential increase in the amount of mining that we would do. And so are we switching away from oil and gas so that we can do more mining? And is that really the environmental change that we're all aspiring to? And I think the answer is it's a little of everything. And that's why we have to thread the needle in terms of sensibility, understanding. That comes from education. And it also requires people to understand the dynamics, to be able to do the math, see what it's going to end up costing, and how it's going to be affordably met. All of that is a big part of the energy program today, and that's what makes it so fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. I do think it is fascinating as well. But I think it's going to take a long time to implement all these changes. And I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think it's going to be a slow progression.
Well, and people would argue, and maybe it's generational, but people would argue that, that we don't have time to slog along. We must make this change overnight. And we're now in the process in many places in the world passing legislation that says by such and such date, we will be doing all of this. Well, it's kind of interesting because over the years and as things have matured, markets and customer demand has always been what's pulled industries and manufacturing toward meeting the expectations of the customer and the clients. And now it seems as if we seem to be much more comfortable, or maybe even uncomfortable, with the fact that governments are now setting the requirements. The cars you're going to drive and the manner in which you're going to behave and things of that nature. And that's in the absence of the magic of technology that can make these emissions disappear without any inconvenience. And so, yeah, government regulations do matter. Government drivers to make change matter. I mean, that's why the power industries in the 70s got rid of sulfur and everything out of the smokestacks of the coal-fired power plants. And that's the reason why we have catalytic converters in our automobiles. But we were able to create pathways with technology to affect the change and enable society to continue to move forward and enjoy the fruits of the world that they're living in. Now, when you start to impose things that are going to require people to behave differently, make sacrifice, this is where the rub occurs. And I believe that rub is showing itself in many places. Great example in Europe. And look at the European electricity prices over the last 10, 20 years. They're way up. And a lot of people are very concerned. Well, these are the consequences of making the decisions to pursue the types of energy supply systems that are in place. Look, here in the United States, we don't even have a carbon tax. We talk about it all the time, but we can't pass a carbon tax. It's politically impossible. And yet, we're intending to impose requirements in a roundabout way for carbon reductions to occur. Well, in many instances, there's no mechanisms to pay for this. And so you begin to get into this uncomfortable dance between governmental requirements, industries having to comply, charging higher prices to customers, and people in the world that don't want to pay higher prices. And there's nothing that legislatively requires these changes to occur other than roundabout environmental regulations. And so we get into these grinding problems of people arguing about, is it right for the environment or is it right for the consumer? And that's what's so difficult. We put ourselves in a box because we don't have the magic of the technology to enable that transformation to occur. That's what industry's striving for. That's what we're working at all the time at the university. And frankly, that's what the students here at the university see as the future, is being able to affect that change, being able to make the difference, quote unquote, that they all want to make in their working lives, right? And so, we all want to change the world. Some ways, students and kids today are far advanced in terms of what they're thinking about in college. I wanted to get out and get a job and make a car payment. That's what I was interested in doing, and wasn't nearly as intellectually further along as many of the young people are today. They want to make a change, but they don't have to go to work for Google or Amazon to make changes in the world. To go to work in the energy segment to make these transformations, I believe, are going to be far more impactful long term in terms of really changing the world. And that's what's so exciting. And you need all the technical skills, you need the brain power, and you need the insights and wisdom to be able to do that. And that's what gets me up every day.
Yeah, that's what I am really interested as well in, is making positive changes to the energy sector. But it's still going to be an ongoing issue, and I think it's going to be the younger generation that's going to really move it forward as well.
Well, it will be by definition, because as you suggested, it's going to take time, and then it's going to take the will. It will also take the innovations that are going to be required. And as people tend to move along the curve in terms of their involvement and activity, The wisdom of experience cannot be undersold, clearly. And so, you can come out of college with a lot of bright ideas, and then you see the realities of things. And I think transformation, again, you get into, I can think back on all of the companies that actually were in existence, and very well-known companies around the world in the late 70s. Many of them aren't even around anymore. I mean, the company I joined was Union Carbide. And who would have ever thought Union Carbide would go away? But it has, and that's been part of the transformation. I worked for Praxair after we went out of Union Carbide and became our own standalone company, wildly successful industrial gas company around the world. And yet Praxair doesn't exist anymore. So I think people need to get comfortable with the fact that change isn't something to resist, it's something to embrace and find a way for that change to be positive and accretive, not destructive.
I do agree, but do you still think there is a lot of people that's opposed to the changes then?
Well, I think a lot of it is because they either don't understand or perhaps don't even want to understand. And I think the most critical debate that I've watched over the last 20 years is the fact that, in the early part of this century, there was still an ongoing debate about, is the climate changing? Well, yeah, the climate's changing, okay? And a lot of the research and everything up to the beginning of this century indicated that it was. Then the argument became, well, what are we going to do to fix it? And how can we fix it? And what are the contributions to it? And then you get into this, I think, politicized debate about, are we doing enough or are we doing too much? And I think the answer is the manner in which we do it and the pathway that we choose is what's going to be critical. And that's not getting enough of the airtime. And to your point, yeah, there are still a lot of people that are resisting it. I think in many ways, because if you make energy less available and you make it more expensive, and you're not able to tie a tangible decrease in the amount of emissions that come from these investments, you just don't do things because they're the quote unquote right thing to do, which is in the eye of the beholder, by the way, not everybody. So you get into these conversations about, am I doing enough? Or the other side of the coin might be, you're doing too much. And some of the time, industry gets pegged into that you're doing too much because many people would view this as disruptive to the business models that the industries currently have. That's a fair comment up to a point, but these are the same industries that are also responding to shareholder movements, making pledges to the investment community for reductions and activities that they're going to promote, invest in, et cetera, to make change. And they're doing it all in a marketplace where the rewards for those investments aren't nearly as clear, I believe, as they could or should be. And so then you have to, as an industry, look at the investments that are being made and saying, am I doing enough? Am I doing it fast enough? Do I want to be the lost leader in all of this, or do I want to be a rapid follower? I mean, you get into all these discussions about shareholder value and whose value are you protecting. And we're doing all this in an atmosphere where we don't have a global carbon tax. We don't have a global platform to evaluate that. And I think we all have to recognize, and to your point about taking time, I think over time, the global marketplace and the construct for the manner in which goods and services are produced and provided, the recognition of the carbon intensity of those products and services have to become essential and focused in terms of this discussion. It isn't yet, but we got to keep reminding ourselves a lot of what we're doing right now is very nascent activity. And as a society, we've become accustomed to instantaneous gratification. That's what technology in the last 50 years or so have conditioned us to, because we've had all this magic happen in our lifetimes. And we're looking around saying, well, let's have some more. And it may not be actually right on our fingertips. And that's where investment, patience, and focus have to happen. And that's often in short supply because we're very good at yelling at each other these days from both sides of the aisle on politics and just about anything. I mean, the loudest voice seems to get the most recognition, and thoughtfulness doesn't seem to be rewarded nearly as well. And so that's a big part, I think, of what's going to have to occur in this next generation is real thoughtfulness, real commitment to making the transformation, doing it in a manner in which you can maintain the lifestyle that you're accustomed to. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up with backlash and whiplash and a bunch of other things. And so you need to move at the right pace with the right results.
I agree as well. But you were saying something really interesting, and that was that we could be doing too much. Do you really think that we could be doing too much?
Well, when we're doing too much, that's the question is, well, what is the measure of what we're trying to accomplish? And I'll go back to what I said before, and that is, what is true sustainability? And true sustainability is not simply lowering your carbon footprint. Some would argue that it is, and that's the only thing that matters. And I disagree with that violently. What I believe is the first order of business is you have to have available electricity that's reliable, available energy that's reliable. You look around the world, we got about 7 billion people. We're going on our way to 10 billion. And most of those people are going to be in places like Asia and Africa. They don't even have any energy today. So getting them energy is a first order issue. And by the way, people in many of those places in the world don't have access to natural gas like we do, don't have access to major grids that are already established that we can act as a platform that we're operating from. So we've got a lot of work to do just to get energy to those people to change their world, because they're in their hut cooking with cow dung, inhaling fumes that an electric cooker could change overnight and make their world completely different from the way it is today, simply by having energy available. We don't think about that in the US or Europe. We take it for granted. We shouldn't. And we need to be very careful about the lens that we see things through. But that's the first order of business on sustainability. The second thing is what I talked about. It has to be affordable and cost effective. We've got to get out of the mindset that everything that we do needs to be government funded. Oh, the government will take care of it to make the. Well, who's the government? The government is us. We have to make a recognition consciously that we, as a society, are making this investment. Well, okay, I'll go with that. But I'm also thinking about most people's concern about cost and affordability and that second order of activity. And really, that plays into the next one, which is the environmental responsibility. That's the third leg of the stool here on real sustainability. And yes, we need to achieve environmental responsibility. We need to lower those carbon footprints. We need to do it as fast as we can, but we better not for a minute think that we can do it and not have real availability, real affordability of this electricity and energy that we're producing, or else we're going to be off on a path that basically disregards the first two things that I mentioned and focuses exclusively on environmental responsibility. That's a pathway that will get us in trouble as a society, because what it says is, I'm going to expect the government to pay for everything. And people don't remember that the government is nothing more than you and I paying taxes into it. And at some point, we're going to have to recognize that everything's not going to be taken care of by the government. We have to make an investment as a society. And so, Michelle, I don't know how many places there are in Europe, but I'll tell you, in the United States, there's an abundance of drive-through facilities all across our country here in all the lower 48 states, whether it's fast food or coffee or you name it, okay? And there's anywhere from 7 to 10 people in line in their cars waiting for their order because they don't pull in, park their car, go in and get their stuff anymore. They sit in their car while it idles. And those idling emissions go into the atmosphere, and people are texting on their cell phone because they have this ubiquitous energy supply, and they have a bumper sticker on their car that says, I care about the environment. And I think that's the fundamental seminal moment that this new generation is going to really have to get their head wrapped around. Do I really care about the environment that much that I'm going to make the kinds of impacts and sacrifices necessary for the environment to be better? Now, does industry need to do a better job? Absolutely. But as consumers and customers, what are we really ready for? And what do we really want? Stop patting yourself on the back with a bumper sticker. Do it and behave in a manner in which we're going to actually see these results. You see the same thing with recycled plastic. Everybody thinks plastic's the worst thing in the world. It's not. It's changed our world dramatically as an energy source. Packaging food and drugs and pharmaceuticals, all that kind of stuff. Everybody sort of hates plastic. And I don't get it. I don't understand why people's heads go there, okay? Because at the end of the day, how many plastic cups do people throw away every day? Don't even think about it, right? And so I think we all have to take a personal accountability for what it is we're doing. And that doesn't mean buying a carbon credit so you can go take a flight and feel good about it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the real kind of behavioral changes and manner in which we operate as people, not just as a society, but as individual people. Are we going in that direction? I hope we are. I hope this new generation is part of that, to your point, but it's going to be critical for it to be so, Michelle.
I think so too. And I think what you were saying is going to take a huge change in people's behavior. And maybe they don't want to do it. Maybe they just want to say that they're doing it, and maybe they think that they're doing it, and maybe they're not. Maybe realistically they're not making positive changes.
And you know what's funny about that? I mean, there's two lines of logic there. First and foremost, many people would say, well, that's why the government needs to do this, that, and the other thing. Well, you got to be careful about that, because when you start mandating things at a government level, then you end up with, again, it goes back to the politicization of many of these arguments, and that can become a challenge. Look, everybody's not enlightened. Everybody doesn't see it the same way. But I'll go back to my plastic example. You know, the 90% of the waste plastic that ends up in the oceans come from 7 rivers in Asia. Well, think about that for a second. What is that all about? Well, you just a lot of people just throwing stuff in the river. Well, we stopped doing that a long time ago. But in the most populous places in the world, they're still doing it. There's piles of junk and stuff all over the place, right? And so, again, I think to go back to what's really important is we have to act locally, develop technologies, and develop change that can really be globally deployed, globally embraced. Something that can then be globally welcomed, not imposed by a United States or a European Union, okay? We have to do things here that we can bring to that part of the world where they're expecting leadership. They're not expecting to get pontification and lectures on how they ought to behave. What they're looking for is the ability to change and for technology changes to come from places in the world where that leadership can come from. They've counted on us for years to be able to do that. And we got to keep doing it, not only because it's good for the world and it's the right thing to do, quote unquote, but because I believe that's where the markets are going to be for most of this over time. And if you really intend to be a sustainable global company, you better have things that are interesting to people in those parts of the world, because that's where all your customers are going to be. We're losing population in Europe, and we're just about breaking even in the US these days, but the growth in the world is in those places in the world. So we got to be thinking that way commercially as well as environmentally, because it's a global challenge, global issue, requires global attention.
I agree. I do agree with that. I do. But do you think it's a realistic goal to be going after, though?
Well, people often say we have to save the planet. And I often say, the planet was here a long, long time before there are any people. And I believe the planet will be here a long, long time after all the people in the world are gone. And that's kind of grim, but it's the truth. And if you look at it, what is society going to make a decision about? They better save themselves. Don't worry about the planet. The planet will be just fine. It'll adapt. It'll do whatever it needs to do ecologically to continue as an orbiting thing, right? It's the people in the world that are going to have to make those decisions. I don't know that I'm wildly optimistic that everybody's ready to change overnight. And usually change requires some type of a motivating factor. And in this case, the climate change has often been described as death by 1,000 cuts. And as we see the impacts of it and watch the news and see the next round of tornadoes and everything else, is it all because of climate change? Is it all because of carbon dioxide and tailpipes from cars and coal-fired power plants? Of course not. We've had tornadoes in the world forever, right? But I think the frequency and the disruptions and things that we're all observing now, I think they're becoming more and more undeniable. And to your point, the next generation is going to make decisions about how the generation after them will, what kind of condition they're going to leave them with. And that's all part of that societal change. You can't make people do stuff that they don't want to do. They have to be motivated to do it. And I don't know that that's ubiquitous globally at this point by any stretch, but I think we have to keep reminding ourselves, let's remember that a lot of this is nascent workings that we're involved in at this point. And unless and until that understanding and then that desire comes from that understanding, that's when you'll really see the big changes. Now, people would argue today, we can't wait that long. We can't wait that long. Well, I don't know. I don't think we have a choice, because the we means all of us, and that means we have to all be on board. And I think perhaps that is the next generation. But the things we can do today, the inflections in terms of our behaviors, investments, and focus areas, we need to do them with no regrets, Michelle. We need to be sure that we're doing things that are smart, but also at the same time continue to keep the support of the society in which we're living in. And I keep going back to the same thing. If it costs more or it makes my energy less reliable, I'm not okay with it today. Okay. Now, tomorrow, will people be more comfortable making sacrifice? I don't think so. So that's why I believe that this whole pathway is going to involve the technological transformations that will enable this to occur on a timely manner, in a manner in which we maintain that reliability and affordability.
I agree. I do agree with you. I do agree.
Geez, Michelle, I haven't said anything that you've disagreed with. We seem to be pretty symbiotic here today, you know?
I know, and I've had several conversations about this topic on, sustainability and net
You
zero,
know,
things like that.
you can find a lot of people that have really strong axes to grind that might actually be counter to what you and I are agreeing on here. That we don't have enough time. We need to do this. We need to do that. Whatever government needs to take over. Blah blah blah. That kind of stuff. I think that's all part of that. Maybe that hysterical fringe that that irritates many people that maybe aren't in the center of the conversation or aren't educated enough. And that's in some instances, those kinds of hysterical people would argue that they're the change agents for the future. And in some ways, I don't know that I'm completely okay with that because I find them to be, well, irritating on one level, but more importantly, perhaps forcing situations that aren't really sustainable. They're just looking at one thing and not really embracing the entirety of the challenge. And got to be careful with that. On the other hand, we cannot be guided by knuckle draggers who don't want to embrace transformation and the fact that the world is changing and we need to be a part of it. Because knuckle draggers don't have a place in the world either. And so both of those polar opposites are going to be there. We need to find enough folks that are in the middle of this conversation with this kind of sensibility that we're talking about today that are really going to drive the bus. And if we do that, we'll have succeeded, at least short term anyway, so that we can move into that generational changes that we're talking about.
I agree. I do agree. Although some people might only see that maybe going to net zero and limiting the production of hydrocarbons is gonna make everything more expensive.
Well, if they don't know that, they aren't fully educated. If they don't know that, they're not being adult in the manner in which they're embracing the challenge. So, being oblivious to something doesn't make you okay because you're passionate about something. I hear that word a lot. I'm passionate about something. Well, okay, be passionate, but be educated, be knowledgeable, know what you're talking about completely. I don't want to hear your passion. I want to hear your knowledge and your ability to develop that pathway to change that's going to be meaningful. Save your passion for yourself or whatever, okay? Don't pat yourself on the back because you're passionate. Pat yourself on the back because you're bringing real solutions and a real adult conversation to change.
Absolutely. And I'm going to end our conversation there on that positive note. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Charles for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening and see you next week.
Michelle, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening and see you next week.